What's up, knowledge seekers? Have you ever watched the news and seen politicians arguing about spending trillions on some project while your country is supposedly broke? People get outraged and demand answers. But here's a mind-blowing fact. Literally every single nation on planet Earth carries debt. France, Canada, Australia, Singapore, you name it, they owe money. Even the wealthiest countries aren't exempt. Japan owes more than double what their entire economy produces annually. And the United States? They're sitting on roughly $36 trillion in debt. And it keeps climbing every second. That's insane, right? This probably makes you wonder, why do nations accumulate so much debt? Why can't they just create unlimited money to solve their problems? Is owing money actually harmful for countries? And here's the big question. If governments owe all this money, exactly who are they borrowing from? Today, we're going to unpack everything you need to understand about government debt. By the end of this video, you'll know why every country borrows money and whether you should actually be worried about it. Let's jump right in. Understanding government debt. When we talk about a nation's debt, economists call it national debt, public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt. All these terms mean the same thing. It's the total amount of money that a country's federal or central government owes to various creditors. Think about it like this. Just like individuals take out loans when they need more money than they have, governments borrow funds when their expenses exceed their income. The key difference is that instead of going to one bank, countries obtain financing from multiple sources including other nations, large financial institutions, international organizations, and even their own citizens. Here's something important to understand. National debt specifically refers to what the central government owes. So when we say the US has $36 trillion in debt, that's only the federal government's obligations. It doesn't include what individual states like Florida or New York owe separately. Yes, states and provinces can have their own debt that's completely separate from national debt. National debt also excludes all the personal debt that citizens have accumulated. So your credit card balances, student loans, car payments, and mortgages don't count toward national debt figures. It's purely what the government itself has borrowed. This distinction matters because when politicians or news outlets talk about debt levels, they're usually referring to what the central government owes, not the total debt picture, including state, local, and private debt. Now that we've clarified what government debt actually is, you're probably wondering why countries need to borrow money in the first place. After all, can't they just print more currency whenever they need it? Let's explore that question next. Why nations need to borrow? You might be thinking, if governments can print money, why do they borrow at all? The answer reveals why borrowing is actually the smarter choice compared to simply creating more currency. When governments print money recklessly, they essentially flood their economy with cash. This leads to hyperinflation, where prices skyrocket because there's too much money chasing the same amount of goods and services. Eventually, that currency becomes worthless. We've seen this disaster play out in countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic groceries. Borrowing forces governments to be more disciplined because debt comes with obligations. They have to pay interest and eventually repay the principal, which encourages more responsible spending decisions. It's like the difference between using someone else's credit card versus your own. You're more careful when you know you'll face consequences. So let's examine the main reasons why governments choose to borrow money. The primary reason is addressing budget shortfalls. Governments generate most of their revenue through taxation, but sometimes tax collections fall short of necessary expenditures. This creates what economists call a budget deficit. For instance, imagine a government collects $2.5 trillion in taxes but needs $3.2 trillion to fund essential services like education, healthcare, defense, and infrastructure. That creates a $700 billion gap that needs to be filled somehow. What are the alternatives? They could slash spending, but that means reduced public services, deteriorating schools, and inadequate healthcare. Policies guaranteed to anger voters. They could raise taxes significantly, but that makes life harder for citizens and businesses, potentially triggering economic slowdowns and political backlash. The most politically feasible solution is borrowing to bridge the gap. This allows governments to maintain services without immediately imposing painful cuts or tax increases on their populations. The second reason is financing economic development. Smart borrowing can actually benefit a country's long-term prospects. Consider a nation that desperately needs modern highways, airports, hospitals, and schools, but lacks the immediate funds to build them. Without borrowing, they'd have to wait decades to accumulate enough savings, during which time their economy would suffer from inadequate infrastructure, poor roads, increased transportation costs, Insufficient hospitals reduce productivity due to health issues, and inadequate schools limit human capital development. By borrowing money to build infrastructure immediately, countries can start seeing economic benefits right away. Better infrastructure attracts businesses, improves productivity, and generates additional tax revenue that can help repay the original investment. It's like borrowing money to buy a car that helps you earn more income. The investment pays for itself over time. The third reason is responding to emergencies and crises. Sometimes governments have absolutely no choice but to borrow massive amounts quickly. Natural disasters, wars, economic recessions, and pandemics require immediate large-scale responses that exceed normal budget capabilities. During 2020, for example, the United States borrowed approximately $4.2 trillion, roughly 20% of their entire GDP, to fund COVID-19 relief programs, unemployment benefits, business support, and vaccine development. Without this emergency borrowing, unemployment could have reached Depression-era levels, and the economic damage would have been far worse. The fourth reason might surprise you: borrowing to pay off existing debt. This isn't necessarily a sign of poor financial management. It's actually a common and often smart practice called debt refinancing. Here's how it works. Suppose a country borrowed money in 2015 that's due for repayment in 2025. When 2025 arrives, they might not have enough cash on hand to pay the full amount. Instead of scrambling to find the money, they can take out a new loan to pay off the old one. This strategy makes sense when interest rates have fallen since the original loan, allowing countries to refinance at better terms. It's similar to refinancing a mortgage when rates drop. You save money over time even though you're still borrowing. However, this becomes problematic when countries continuously roll over debt without ever actually reducing the total amount owed. Sri Lanka fell into this trap, eventually defaulting on over $50 billion in external debt in 2022, leading to massive social unrest and economic collapse. The fifth reason is using debt as an economic policy tool. Advanced economies sometimes borrow money not because they're short on cash, but because borrowing and lending can help control inflation, stabilize currency values, and influence economic growth rates. When inflation runs too hot, governments can issue bonds to pull excess money out of circulation, cooling down price increases. Conversely, when economic growth stagnates, governments can borrow and spend money to stimulate demand and encourage business activity. This approach requires sophisticated understanding of monetary policy, but when executed properly, it helps smooth out economic cycles and maintain stability. Now that we understand why countries borrow, the next logical question is, where does all this money actually come from? The sources of government financing. When you consider that governments routinely borrow hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars, you might wonder which institutions have that kind of money lying around. The reality is that no single entity provides all this funding. Instead, countries tap into three major sources of financing. The first major source is domestic lending, money that comes from within the country itself. This might surprise you, but ordinary citizens like you can actually lend money to your own government. This happens through government bonds and treasury securities. When you purchase a government bond, you're essentially giving the government a loan. In return, they promise to pay you back the original amount plus interest after a specified period. So if you buy a $1,000 government bond with 3% annual interest for 10 years, the government will pay you $30 each year and return your $1,000 at the end. It's not just individual citizens who buy these bonds. Major domestic banks like JP Morgan Chase or Wells Fargo purchase billions of dollars worth of government securities as investments, investment funds, insurance companies, and even large corporations buy government bonds because they're considered extremely safe investments. There's also something called intragovernmental debt, which sounds complicated but is actually straightforward. This occurs when one government agency lends money to another. For example, the Social Security Administration might use its surplus funds to buy treasury bonds, essentially lending money to the federal government while earning interest that helps fund future benefits. As of early 2025, approximately $7.5 trillion of U.S. national debt, roughly 20% of the total, consists of these intragovernmental holdings. It's like different departments within a large corporation lending money to each other. The second major source is international lending. Foreign individuals, banks, companies, and governments can all purchase another country's government bonds. For instance, citizens of Germany or banks in the UK can buy U.S. Treasury bonds just like Americans can. Foreign governments are particularly significant purchasers of government debt from stable economies. Japan and China are the largest foreign holders of U.S. Treasury securities, each owning between $1 to $1.1 trillion worth. They buy these bonds partly as investments to earn returns on their foreign currency reserves, and partly for strategic economic reasons. However, when a country's economy becomes unstable or risky, foreign investors become reluctant to buy their bonds because they worry about getting repaid. Would you lend money to someone you weren't sure could pay you back? Probably not. For countries with weaker economies or higher risk profiles, international lending often comes through specialized institutions rather than bond markets. Organizations like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and African Development Bank provide direct loans specifically for infrastructure and development projects. These institutions offer lower interest rates than commercial markets, but attach strict conditions about how the money can be used. They might require countries to follow specific environmental standards, governance practices, or economic policies as loan conditions. When countries face severe financial crises and can't borrow from normal sources, they turn to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, as a last resort. The IMF provides emergency loans to prevent complete economic collapse, but these come with extremely strict conditions. IMF loans typically require countries to implement structural adjustment programs, policies like reducing government spending, privatizing state-owned companies, removing trade barriers, and raising taxes. While these policies might stabilize finances, they often cause significant social hardship and political unrest. Greece, Argentina, and several other countries have experienced this firsthand. The third source is a country's own central bank. In theory, governments can borrow directly from their central banks through a process called monetary financing, or debt monetization. The central bank creates new money and uses it to buy government bonds. However, most developed countries avoid this practice because it can lead to currency devaluation and inflation. When central banks create money to buy government debt, it increases the money supply, which can reduce the currency's value and drive up prices. Instead, central banks typically buy government bonds indirectly through open market operations. They purchase bonds from commercial banks and other institutions that bought them first. This allows central banks to influence interest rates and money supply without directly funding government spending. Understanding these funding sources helps explain why some countries can borrow easily at low rates while others struggle to find willing lenders. When debt becomes dangerous. Now here's the crucial question: is government debt actually harmful? The answer isn't straightforward because debt can be either beneficial or destructive, depending on how it's managed and what it's used for. Let's start with why debt can be good. When governments use borrowed money wisely, investing in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and other productivity-enhancing projects, it can generate economic growth that more than pays for the borrowing costs. It's like a business taking out a loan to buy equipment that increases their revenue. During economic crises, government borrowing can prevent much worse outcomes. The massive borrowing during COVID-19, while expensive, likely prevented a complete economic collapse that would have cost far more in lost jobs, business failures, and human suffering. Moderate levels of debt also provide flexibility. Countries with good credit can borrow quickly when opportunities or emergencies arise, rather than being constrained by whatever cash they happen to have on hand. However, excessive debt creates serious problems. When debt levels become too high relative to a country's ability to service them, several dangerous dynamics emerge. First, an increasing portion of government revenue goes toward interest payments rather than productive spending. Instead of building schools or hospitals, money gets diverted to paying bondholders. This reduces the government's ability to provide essential services or invest in economic growth. Second, high debt levels can trigger confidence crises. If investors begin doubting a country's ability to repay its obligations, they demand higher interest rates to compensate for the increased risk. This makes borrowing more expensive, creating a vicious cycle where debt service costs consume an ever larger share of government resources. Countries, like individuals, have credit ratings that reflect their ability to repay debt. When rating agencies like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, or Fitch downgrade a country's credit rating, it becomes more expensive and difficult to borrow money. In extreme cases, countries might find themselves unable to borrow at reasonable rates, forcing them toward default. Default occurs when a country declares it cannot or will not repay its debts as agreed. Unlike corporate bankruptcy, there's no international court that can force a country to liquidate assets to pay creditors. Instead, defaulting countries typically face economic sanctions, exclusion from international financial markets, and severe economic disruption. Sri Lanka's 2022 default illustrates these consequences. After defaulting on over $50 billion in external debt, the country experienced currency collapse, severe shortages of fuel and medicine, and widespread social unrest that led to the president's resignation. So how much debt is too much? Economists often use the debt-to-GDP ratio as a rough measure. This compares a country's total debt to the size of its economy. For example, If a country has $80 billion in debt and a $100 billion economy, their debt-to-GDP ratio is 80%. Many economists consider ratios below 60% relatively safe, though this isn't a hard rule. Some countries like Japan have functioned with debt-to-GDP ratios exceeding 250%, while others have faced crises at much lower levels. The key factors include the currency the debt is denominated in, the maturity structure, who owns the debt, and the country's overall economic stability. Some countries implement debt ceilings, legal limits on how much debt the government can accumulate. The United States has such a limit, though Congress routinely raises it to avoid default. These ceilings are intended to encourage fiscal responsibility, but in practice they often become political tools rather than meaningful economic constraints. The sustainability of debt ultimately depends on a country's ability to generate enough economic growth and tax revenue to service their obligations without undermining essential government functions or economic stability. The impossibility of debt-free nations. This brings us to an intriguing question. Could a country eliminate all its debt and operate debt-free? Technically, yes, but practically speaking, no major economy attempts this, and for good economic reasons. Currently, no sovereign nation operates completely without debt. Every country maintains some level of borrowing for the strategic and practical reasons we've discussed. The closest example might be Macau, but Macau isn't actually an independent country. It's a special administrative region of China with unique economic circumstances. Macau can operate with minimal debt because it's essentially a city-state with only about 650,000 residents covering just 30 square kilometers. More importantly, Macau generates enormous revenue from its casino industry, more per capita than Las Vegas, providing the government with abundant cash flow that eliminates borrowing needs. Obviously, entire countries can't transform themselves into giant casinos to eliminate debt. The economic and social structures that work for a small territory don't scale to nations of millions or hundreds of millions of people. But even if a large country could eliminate all debt, most economists argue this wouldn't be desirable. Here's why. Completely eliminating debt would require either massive spending cuts or enormous tax increases, both of which could trigger economic recessions and social unrest. Imagine if the US government suddenly had to balance its budget without borrowing. They'd need to cut spending by roughly $1.5 to $2 trillion annually, or raise taxes by equivalent amounts. Either approach would likely crash the economy. Debt-free countries would also eliminate government bonds from their financial markets. This might sound like a good thing, but government bonds serve crucial functions beyond just funding government operations. They provide safe, low-risk investment options that pension funds, insurance companies, and individual savers depend on for retirement planning and capital preservation. Without government bonds, these institutions would be forced to invest in riskier assets, making the entire financial system more volatile and potentially jeopardizing retirement security for millions of people. Government bonds also serve as benchmarks for pricing other types of debt throughout the economy. Corporate bonds, mortgages, and other loans are typically priced at interest rates higher than comparable government securities. Without this benchmark, pricing other debt instruments becomes much more difficult and uncertain. Additionally, the ability to issue debt provides countries with important economic policy tools. During recessions, governments can stimulate economic activity through deficit spending. During periods of excessive inflation, they can cool the economy by reducing spending or raising taxes. Debt-free countries would lose much of this flexibility to respond to economic cycles. The goal for most countries isn't eliminating debt entirely, but rather maintaining debt at sustainable levels that support economic growth without creating financial instability. So there you have it, the complete picture of why every nation carries debt and who they owe money to. Government debt isn't inherently good or bad. It's a financial tool that can either fuel prosperity or create disaster, depending on how it's managed. The key insight is that successful countries don't focus on eliminating debt completely, but rather on using debt strategically to invest in their future while maintaining the ability to service their obligations. It's about balance and responsibility, not debt-free purity. Next time someone complains about government debt, you'll understand that the real question isn't whether countries should have debt, but whether they're borrowing for the right reasons and managing it responsibly. There's actually much more to explore about government debt, like why some countries handle massive debt loads easily, while others collapse under smaller burdens, or what actually happens when a country defaults. Those might be perfect topics for future videos. If you found this breakdown helpful and want more economics education made simple, hit that like button and subscribe to Knowledge for Dummies 101. What economic mystery should we unravel next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and I'll make it happen. Thanks for watching, and remember, knowledge is the best investment you can make.